Holy crap, I'm standing. That's new. So are these fake glasses that make you think I'm smart. Alright, today we're going to talk about one of the most famous science fiction authors in literary history, H.G. Wells. Now, everyone knows him for, of course, The War of the Worlds, notoriously and confusingly narrated by Orson Welles several years later, and made popular through that event. Which is basically the story of a bunch of really weird alien things versus the most likely thing to ever kill weird alien things that tried to invade Earth, bacteria. Unfortunately, since it's a battle between two weird squiggly things, it's kind of lacking in the human element. Now, for a long time, The War of the Worlds was the only H.G. Wells novel I read. Because of that reason, and it's kind of the reason I stopped reading science fiction in general, was because science fiction lacked that human element, that character that I really liked. And then, through a couple of friends, I read H.G. Wells's The History of Mr. Polly, which is one of the most human works of fiction I have ever read, and it's certainly one of my favorites, if not my outright favorite work of fiction that I've ever read. But what about The History of Mr. Polly makes it so human? I have to say that it's the contrast that it shows within its characters. By that I mean it shows multiple sides of their personalities. It shows the external shells that they wear, and it also shows their vulnerabilities. The first really interesting major character that we meet, other than Mr. Polly himself, is Parsons, who is very much sort of this Tony Stark almost style young. He's got young guy. He's got a lot of ideas. He gets wrapped up in the ideological reformation that's happening in the early 1900s, and regarding art, and kind of applies it to his weird little apprenticeship as a shelf dresser. And they, back in the day, of course, they literally have jobs for people to dress the windows that people would see outside the shops, and that's kind of what this group of people did. And he, is like, well, I'm gonna do this a different way, and does this like totally bold, crazy thing instead of just setting things out. In this really orderly fashion, like you're supposed to, and it goes wrong. But Parsons is interesting not just because he's an innovator, but also because he is vulnerable. In multiple instances, he is incredibly vulnerable. For instance, after so the window thing happens, he tries his innovation with dressing windows, and then he gets into a literal fist fight with his manager, and and then he is like, yeah, no, I was the one to blame for that. We're keeping that. I'm not gonna press charges against him for counter-assaulting me. I hit him first, and it comes off as such a moment of vulnerability. And there are many other instances of this as well. A relatively minor character, the oldest, I think, Larson's sister, Annie, who's this very, again, rather boisterous, sort of loud, outgoing sort. At the end of the funeral party at which she's introduced, which was a thing, again, culture, read the book, seriously, she just has this moment where she kind of settles down and goes, yeah, that was fun. And again, it's such a moment that connects. The novel overall is actually more about risk-taking and not being complacent with your life. But it's also very much about honesty and pursuing the feelings that you actually want, pursuing your real desires instead of just letting life happen to you. And this vulnerability is essential to that, because if you don't admit to yourself what your own desires are, you're not going to chase after them. The novel ends with Mr. Polly having figured out how to do this, having done this for the last 7 years or so. And he's sitting on this dock with his friend. Sunset. They're watching a sunset. It's a beautiful sunset. And he remarks upon it. And he says, I could live for sunsets. And his friend goes, they don't really help you very much. And then Mr. Polly responds, the only way you really can respond. Who cares?